Hey there, and welcome to tonight's journey into the shadows of medieval minds. Imagine the flicker of candlelight on ancient stone walls, the distant echo of armored footsteps, and the hush of secrets passed down through centuries. You might think you know medieval knights, hardened, stoic, immune to fear, but tonight I'll reveal a side of them you've likely never heard, including a chilling warning from a knight who saw terror where none should have existed. If you genuinely enjoy unraveling the mysteries of history, remember to like and subscribe. It helps us keep the torchlit stories coming. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you settle in for this bedtime tale? Drop your answer in the comments so we can all share this quiet moment together, wherever we are. Now, dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's slip gently into the world of medieval Europe, a world where war left scars on the soul, as well as the body. Let's start with a moment that still gives me goosebumps. Picture Geoff Desiré, a seasoned French knight from the chaos of the 100 Years' War, sitting by his writing desk, quill scratching across parchment. In his book of chivalry, he didn't just offer swordblade techniques or advice on honor. No, he warned his fellow warriors of something far more unsettling. When they would be secure from danger, he wrote, they will be beset by great terror. Now, pause for a second and let that sink in. Even after the blood and noise of battle had faded, when a knight was supposedly safe, fear would creep in, sometimes worse than anything they faced on the field. Doesn't that sound familiar? Modern soldiers often describe anxiety, sleeplessness, and a constant sense of dread long after leaving the front lines. Desiré's words echo through the centuries, suggesting that medieval fighters struggled with something we now call PTSD, even if they didn't have a name for it. He described nights filled with terror, a sense that even nature itself seemed to turn against them. I wonder, have you ever felt fear at the very moment you thought you could finally relax? If so, you're not alone. Even the most ironclad warriors of the past wrestled with those same midnight shadows. What's fascinating is that Desiré didn't try to hide this vulnerability. He treated it almost as an expected part of a soldier's life. Being haunted by memories and fears wasn't a sign of weakness. It was just another occupational hazard, right up there with a dented helmet or a scarred hand. That's a far cry from the old myth that knights and men at arms were somehow too tough or too conditioned to suffer mental wounds. So, let's toss out the idea that people back then were emotionally invincible. They were human. Sometimes heartbreakingly so. Tonight, I want you to set aside the image of the unflappable medieval warrior. Instead, let's wander through the chronicles, letters, and even the prayers of the Middle Ages, searching for traces of haunted hearts, restless minds, and the weight of invisible burdens carried long after the banners came down. But before we get further into these stories, let me offer a warm welcome if you're new here. Settle in, and if you're enjoying our fireside gathering, remember to tap that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. This channel keeps going thanks to your support and the wonderful folks who visited the merch store for a little piece of history. Thank you for helping us keep the lantern burning. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine medieval Europe. It's a world thick with violence, where war isn't a rare occasion but part of the fabric of life. Sometimes it's a petty feud, other times a grand crusade. But there's always a battle brewing somewhere. And that's not even counting the public executions that fill town squares, or the silent, ever-present threat of plague. Death wasn't just a distant rumor. It was a neighbor, a shadow at the edge of every day. You might think, then, that people back then were simply tougher than we are today. Maybe they were desensitized, having grown up with the sight of animal slaughter or the aftermath of a skirmish outside the village walls. For a nobleman, the path to adulthood was paved with hunting, fighting, and the expectation of bloodshed. That kind of upbringing could blunt the shock, maybe even numb the heart to violence. But does it really make someone immune to fear and grief? That's the question we're here to explore. Cultural conditioning did its best to shield the mind. Knights, for instance, were trained to view themselves as God's chosen instruments, or as living heroes straight from the pages of chivalric legend. This way of thinking could help soften the moral agony of battle. After all, if you're fighting for a holy cause, or living up to the standards of legendary warriors, it's easier to justify the horrors you witness or commit on the field. And it wasn't just in Western Europe. In the Byzantine East, soldiers lived in a state of near-constant readiness. The empire was a fortress, always bracing against new threats. Military manuals from Constantinople didn't just teach sword drills. They hammered home discipline, courage, and the need to keep panic at bay. The goal was to create a wall of resolve as sturdy as any city rampart. But, as any modern historian will tell you, no amount of training can make flesh and bone immune to the aftershocks of war. The human mind, after all, hasn't changed that much in 1,000 years. We still bleed the same, and we still break the same way. Adrenaline, shock, heartbreak, these weren't mysteries to medieval people. They saw the toll that terror and loss took on a person. In fact, medieval writers sometimes spoke quite openly about madness brought on by war. In 15th century France, for example, people recognized that battle could drive a person out of their mind. There was even a distinction between good madness, like the wild, fearless rage that made a knight a terror on the battlefield, and bad madness, when trauma left someone shattered and unable to function, even after the fighting was done. It's a bit darkly amusing, isn't it? If your trauma made you fierce and dangerous, society cheered you on. But if it left you broken and unable to serve, you became an object of pity, or worse, ridicule. Basically, as long as you were useful, your suffering was heroic. Once you were no longer an asset, well, let's just say medieval empathy had its limits. Funny how that works. But even in this tough love culture, people didn't pretend psychological wounds didn't exist. They acknowledged the damage, even if they sometimes misunderstood it. Religion, though, added another layer to this picture. The Christian worldview in Europe and the Islamic beliefs in the Near East both offered explanations for suffering that went far beyond anything we'd call psychology today. If a knight was tormented by nightmares of the men he'd killed, he might believe he was haunted, literally, by restless spirits or demons seeking revenge. This wasn't just a metaphor. The idea of being plagued by ghosts goes way back, even before the Middle Ages. Ancient Mesopotamian texts from over 3,000 years ago describe soldiers hounded by the angry spirits of those they'd slain, their sleep shattered by visions they could not escape. Christian clergy in medieval Europe had their own theories. If a veteran couldn't sleep or saw visions, it might be chalked up to demonic attack, or perhaps punishment from God for sins committed in battle. The Church had a toolkit for this: penance, prayer, and rituals meant to heal the soul. Sometimes, the wounds of war were treated as spiritual afflictions, not just mental ones. Meanwhile, in Islamic societies, the explanations could be different, but just as supernatural. A soldier haunted by dread or strange visions might be said to suffer from the influence of jinn, those elusive beings who could torment or test a believer's faith. Let me pause here, because the idea of jinn is wonderfully complex. In Islamic tradition, jinn are spirits, sometimes mischievous, sometimes downright menacing, who can shape a person's experiences in mysterious ways. So, what we might call trauma or anxiety could, in a medieval Muslim context, be seen as a spiritual trial or even a kind of possession. Understanding all these layers is crucial if we want to read medieval accounts with any kind of empathy. A soldier from the 13th century wouldn't say, "I have PTSD." That language didn't exist. Instead, he might talk about being tormented by devils at night, or feeling that his soul was in peril. Our challenge is to read between the lines, listening closely to what these voices from the past are really telling us, without projecting our modern ideas too forcefully onto their world. We want to meet them halfway, recognizing that while our vocabulary has changed, the ache of a troubled mind is timeless. So tonight, as we settle in by the fire and sift through the pages of old manuscripts, let's keep our minds open. We're starting with the concept of PTSD, a strictly modern term, but our real goal is to trace the deep roots of war's psychological toll, roots that wind through every culture, every era. The medieval world may be separated from us by centuries, but its stories of haunted nights and restless souls are, in the end, deeply, achingly human. But before we analyze specific episodes, a quick little caveat. Before we start sifting through the stories of battered souls and haunted minds, allow me a brief word of caution. It's tempting to look back and hand out diagnoses. Aha, that's classic PTSD. But remember, those are labels of our own era. The term itself, post-traumatic stress disorder, only made its way into medical books in the late 20th century. Earlier generations had their own terms, like shell shock or combat fatigue, words born in the trenches of modern wars. For our medieval kin, though, there were no neat categories, no clinical checklists. What we can do, as humble chroniclers around this flickering fire, is look for patterns, behaviors and confessions that echo what we now recognize as the wounds of war, even if our ancestors framed them in poetry, prayer, or the language of curses and fate. So, with that in mind, let's step back into the mists of the early Middle Ages, roughly the 5th through the 10th centuries. If you're hoping for diary entries or tear-stained letters from the front lines, well, I'm afraid I must disappoint you. Such personal records from common soldiers are as rare as a warm bed in a Viking winter. But don't let that dampen your curiosity. Instead, we turn to the old stories, the epic poems, the winding sagas, and the terse jottings of chroniclers. These are our windows into the minds of warriors, and even if the glass is stained by legend and embellishment, we can still glimpse the shadows of fear and sorrow lurking beneath the armor. Let's begin with a poem that has echoed down the centuries, a piece not from the pen of a king's scribe, but from the heart of an exiled wanderer. I speak, of course, of the Old English poem known simply as The Wanderer. Imagine a bleak northern shore, icy waves breaking on the rocks. Here a lone survivor drifts through the world, bereft of his lord and all his battle companions. He is haunted not by wounds of the body, but by the ache of memory. The faces of the dead crowd his dreams. In one of the poem's most haunting moments, the weary warrior falls asleep and, just for a heartbeat, imagines himself back in the warmth of the mead hall, laughter ringing, friends gathered close, his lord alive and smiling. But then, cruelly, he wakes. The warmth is gone. He sees only the endless grey sea, the flapping of seabirds, frost and snow swirling together. Listen to these words as I recite a few lines. Then the friendless man wakes again, sees before him the fallow waves, seabirds bathing, spreading their wings, frost and snow falling, mingled with hail. Then the wounds of the heart are heavier, aching for beloved ones. Sorrow is renewed. There's an honesty in those lines that hits harder than any sword blow. What is this but a flashback, a vivid return to a lost world, followed by crushing grief? The dream of reunion gives way to emptiness, and the wounds of the heart reopen, raw as ever. This is not simply nostalgia. It's the kind of sorrow that clings to survivors, the kind that modern minds might call survivor's guilt, or the heavy fog of depression that so often follows battle. The poem's imagery, ghosts crowding the mind, spirits of the dead swirling like snow, shows us just how deeply the war dead haunted those left behind. Even in the early Middle Ages, people saw that a fighting man might be troubled by memories long after his sword was sheathed. Now let's leave the foggy English shore and venture north into the land of the Norse. Here, in the sagas of Iceland, we find another kind of warrior and another flavor of fear. These sagas, written down centuries later but rooted in Viking Age tales, are full of boasting heroes and epic brawls. Yet now and again, if you read closely, you'll catch a glimpse of something else, the aftershocks of violence. Take the case of Grettir Asmundarsson, the legendary hero of Grettir's saga. Grettir was as tough as they come, a giant of a man, famous for wrestling trolls and thrashing bandits. But his greatest test came in a grim battle with Glum, an undead revenant who terrorized a remote farmstead. Picture the scene. Night deepens, wind howling around the homestead, and Grettir stands alone against the monstrous Glam. After a brutal fight, Grettir prevails, but not without a cost. With his dying breath, Glam curses him, and from that moment on, our fearless hero is no longer so fearless. The saga tells us plainly, Grettir is struck with an unshakable fear of the dark. Now, pause with me and consider that. Here is a Viking champion, the very model of bravery, suddenly rendered anxious by nightfall. He cannot bear to be alone in darkness. The tale describes him always seeking company after sunset, or at least the comfort of a burning lamp. Shadows seem to crawl with Glam's staring dead eyes. What do we call this, if not a kind of trauma? In modern terms, gritty hair shows symptoms of hyperarousal, constant fear, vigilance, and disturbing visions, all triggered by a horrifying event. The saga, of course, calls it a curse. But strip away the supernatural, and what remains is a man forever changed by a single night of terror. I always find it remarkable that the sagas, which so often celebrate hard men and harder deeds, allow for these admissions of weakness. It's as if even the Norse recognized that violence leaves marks on the soul, not just the body. In fact, the sagas also give us the figure of the berserker, warriors who whip themselves into a battle frenzy, feeling no pain and performing feats beyond ordinary men. But after the fury faded, these men would collapse into exhaustion, sometimes suffering fits of melancholy or wild mood swings. Some scholars have wondered if this berserk rage was a sort of socially approved way to cope with the terrors of combat, a mental shield that let them survive, though at the cost of peace afterward. Of course, the sources aren't exactly brimming with sympathy for berserkers. Often, they're depicted as dangerous, unstable, and out of control. Still, the very existence of these stories shows that medieval people noticed strange changes in those who survived the worst battles, struggles with mood, fear, and self-control, that we'd now recognize as psychological fallout. Now, you might ask, what about the historical records? Did any chronicler, tucked away in his monastery, ever write down the inner torments of a veteran? Well, not often. The chronicles of Charlemagne's age or the Viking conquests tend to focus on great events and grand victories, not the nightmares of common men. They're more interested in who won, who lost, and who got to write the next chapter of history. But if you read carefully, you'll spot hints of deeper wounds. Consider the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And, for those especially keen, I have a full reading of that elsewhere in the library, an evening's entertainment for the truly devoted. In its spare, understated style, the Chronicle recounts the years of Viking raids and ceaseless war across England. After one especially bloody battle, it notes the many widows making lamentation, and adds that even the survivors were sore wounded in spirit. What a phrase, sore wounded in spirit. It's not detailed, but it's telling. It hints that those who survived the carnage carried invisible scars as real as any axe wound. There's another example in the poem commemorating the Battle of Maldon in 991. It's a stirring piece, full of boasts and defiance, but underneath the heroics, you can sense a community reeling in shock and sorrow. The poem praises sacrifice, yet there's a clear undercurrent of grief, a sense that the survivors are left to pick up the pieces of a world shattered by violence. And sometimes the burdens of battle became too much for a warrior to bear. In those moments, some sought solace not in another fight, but in faith. There are stories, half history, half legend, of battle-weary fighters who turned their backs on the sword and sought peace in the cloister. Take the Anglo-Saxon nobleman Guthlac, for instance, who lived in the 7th and 8th centuries. In his youth, Guthlac led mercenary bands and took part in bloody raids. But after years of violence, he laid down his weapons, repented, and retreated to the wild fenlands to live as a hermit. Legend tells that Guthlac was tormented at night by demons, horrific visions and apparitions that attacked him in his solitude. Now, some modern readers see these demons as symbols for the psychological struggles of a warrior haunted by his past. The hagiographers describe these demons as taunting Guthlac with memories of his old comrades and the faces of those he'd slain. They tried to overwhelm him with guilt and fear, driving him to the brink of madness. But Guthlac, so the story goes, fought back with prayer and fasting, a spiritual battle to quiet the ghosts of his past. To our modern ears, this sounds almost like a case study in combat trauma, nightmares, flashbacks, guilt, and the desperate search for healing. The remedy in this telling is religious devotion. Whether you take the story literally or see it as a metaphor, the pattern is clear. The wounds of war drove some to seek drastic change, and the church was ready to receive them, offering penance and, perhaps, a kind of absolution. It's a pattern we see again and again. The idea that a warrior's soul, battered by violence, could be healed through faith and ritual. If you think that's just a quirk of the Anglo-Saxons, look east to the Byzantine Empire. There, too, we find hints that commanders and chroniclers understood the mental toll of war. Procopius, writing in the 6th century, describes soldiers struck by sudden, inexplicable panic on the battlefield, what we might call acute stress reactions. Another account from a disastrous 10th century campaign tells of men left benumbed with terror, some unable even to speak of what they had seen. The Byzantines even had a word for one particular affliction, nostalgia or homesickness, a deep, aching melancholy that could grip soldiers on long campaigns far from home. It's strikingly similar to what Swiss doctors would much later call nostalgia in their mercenaries, a kind of depression brought on by longing for familiar places and faces. The Byzantine response was practical. Sometimes they'd rotate troops back home or bolster morale with religious icons and ritual. They understood, at least in part, that these burdens couldn't be ignored. Interestingly, military manuals from the Byzantine world show a surprising awareness of these issues. The 6th century Emperor Maurice, in his treatise on war, the Strategicon, advises commanders to keep their men occupied after a terrifying battle. He writes that they should encourage and reassure those who seem shaken, so that fear does not take root and spread like a contagion. It's not so far from modern ideas about debriefing soldiers and tending to invisible wounds. So, as we gather the threads from the early Middle Ages, what do we see? Survivors haunted by memories and dreams, heroes cursed with lasting fears, warriors seeking penance for the blood they shed, commanders trying, sometimes clumsily, to tend to the inner wounds of their men. The language may be different. Sorrow, curses, penance, demons, but the feelings are familiar. Grief, fear, guilt. The scars of war, it seems, are as old as war itself. And so, as the centuries turn and we move into the high Middle Ages with new armies, new creeds, and new kinds of war, the stories become even more vivid. The Crusades and the Norman Conquest will bring us tales of wounded souls on a grand scale, and chroniclers will finally begin to write down what soldiers saw, suffered, and sometimes could not bear to remember. So, pull your cloak a little tighter, my friends, and stoke up the fire. In our next chapter, we'll step into an age when the clash of faith and steel brought new forms of trauma and new ways to seek solace. The High Middle Ages, 11th to the 13th centuries, ushered in an era of intense and often religiously inspired conflict. Lean in close, for we're about to venture into the heart of the High Middle Ages, a time when faith and warfare marched side by side, and the wounds of battle ran deeper than flesh and bone. You may picture the Crusades, those legendary journeys to the Holy Land. But before the first crusader ever set foot on Eastern soil, the fires of war had already scorched the fields of England. The Norman conquest, beginning in 1066, stands as a grim prelude, and it's here that our tale of moral injury and coping truly begins. Imagine William the Conqueror's knights, fresh from their triumph at Hastings, suddenly plunged into the merciless campaign known as the Harrying of the North. This was no chivalrous contest, but a deliberate devastation, with villages burned, crops destroyed, and entire communities left to starve. Medieval chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis did not shy away from the horror. He paints a scene of desolate countryside, blackened by fire, where even the most battle-hardened Normans began to question their mission. Excessive cruelty, he called it, and coming from a chronicler who often celebrated military valor. That's saying something. Let's pause and ask ourselves, what would it take for a seasoned knight, schooled in the brutal arts of war, to recoil at his own orders? Some modern historians see in these reactions the early glimmers of what we now call moral injury, a deep wound to the conscience, inflicted not by sword or spear, but by the knowledge of one's own deeds. The records tell us that a handful of Norman soldiers went so far as to rebel or refuse to carry out further atrocities. They were not simply tired. They were tormented by a sense that they had crossed an invisible line. And here's where things get fascinating. William, ever the shrewd ruler, saw that something had to be done to manage this collective guilt. So, with the help of the bishops of Normandy, he introduced a remarkable system of penance in 1067. Picture it, a gathering of churchmen issuing a solemn ordinance for every man who fought at Hastings. The rules were simple, but severe. If you knew you'd killed a man, you owed a full year of penance for each life taken. If you'd wounded someone, but weren't sure of the outcome, 40 days of penance per strike would do. It's almost comical if it weren't so grim. Imagine the seasoned killers tallying up their grim accounts, facing a lifetime of prescribed penance. Here they were, ordered to kill for king and country, only to find themselves sentenced to years, sometimes lifetimes, of fasting and prayer by the very church that had blessed their banners. And what about the archers, you might wonder? There's a certain medieval logic here. Since they couldn't possibly count how many men fell to their arrows, they were let off with a few lents of fasting, which, all things considered, might have felt like a bargain. For those who truly couldn't remember, or perhaps didn't want to, there was another path. Penance 1 day a week for the rest of their lives, or, if that seemed too much, a comfortable retirement in a monastery, seeking forgiveness. It's an extraordinary bit of medieval bureaucracy, isn't it? A kind of spiritual therapy, centuries before the word therapy ever entered the language. Let's read between the lines here. The Church, while certainly focused on cleansing souls, also recognized that there was a psychological toll to be paid by those who waged war. This structured penance gave warriors a way to process their guilt, a ritual to transform haunting memories into manageable penance. For a knight who lay awake at night, tormented by visions of starving peasants or burning villages, this system offered a glimmer of hope, an avenue to atonement. William himself was not immune to these concerns. To atone for the blood spilled at Hastings, he founded Battle Abbey on the very site of his victory. Was this an act of political showmanship? Absolutely. But it also stands as a monument to the coping mechanisms of the age, a transformation of violence into sacred memory, and a public acknowledgement that even conquerors need a path to forgiveness. The chronicles suggest that these measures mattered. Soldiers disturbed by famine and atrocity found in the church's ordinances not only a spiritual salve, but perhaps also a practical way to quiet their troubled minds. It's easy to laugh at the medieval obsession with counting penance days, but at its core, this was an early effort to grapple with the inner scars of combat. So, let me ask you, if you had stood on those windswept fields, would you have found solace in penance, or would guilt have haunted you still, no matter how many prayers you recited? The very fact that such questions arose in the 11th century tells us something profound. The trauma of war and the search for healing are as old as war itself. Now, as we turn our gaze from the Norman countryside to the deserts of the Holy Land, we'll see how these struggles with trauma, faith, and the machinery of institutional coping only grew more complex. When the Crusades to the Holy Land began in the late 11th century, similar dynamics played out on a much larger scale. When the call went out for the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century, it was as if all the anxieties, hopes, and hidden wounds of Christendom were bundled up and shipped east, tied together with the banner of the cross. Now, let me invite you to pull up your stool a bit closer to the fire, because what happened next wasn't just a story of flags and swords. It was an epic struggle of minds and souls, played out across the baking plains of the Holy Land, and in the hearts of every man and woman who set out on that road. You've probably heard the tales, knights marching toward Jerusalem, banners snapping, lances gleaming, faith burning so bright it seemed nothing could pierce their armor. But if you read between the lines of those old chronicles, if you listen for the quieter, trembling voices behind the triumphant hymns, you'll find another story lurking there. You see, the First Crusade, from 1096 to 1099, was an eruption of violence on a scale that even hardened warriors struggled to comprehend. Medieval chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres and Raymond of Aguilers painted nightmarish scenes at the siege of Jerusalem. They wrote with a sort of chilling exultation of crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood through the holy precincts. One writer even described a temple courtyard so thick with the slain that the victors could hardly walk a straight line. At first glance, when you leaf through those Christian accounts, you might get the impression that the Crusaders were nothing but elated, almost intoxicated, by the violence. Their words are soaked in triumph. They claim the slaughter was God's will, the city cleansed of unbelief, the land restored to righteousness. It almost reads like the aftermath of a great sporting victory, not a massacre. But if you sit with these texts a while, you start to catch hints that not everyone was so untroubled. Take, for example, Raymond of Toulouse, a commander so committed to the cause that you'd expect him to be first through the gates. Yet after the bloodbath, he refused to enter Jerusalem straight away. Some said it was humility before God, but others whispered that he was shaken to his core by what he'd just witnessed. Shortly after the conquest, many crusaders, their vows fulfilled, seemed desperate to get home. Why? Was it only exhaustion and disease, or did a deeper sickness gnaw at them, something that couldn't be washed away by prayers or victory songs? We know from reports that hundreds died on the journey home, not just from fever or wounds, but from a kind of collapse, as if their very spirits had been spent. There's an anonymous account of a knight on the return voyage who woke screaming during storms, convinced that God was sending down punishment for the lives he'd taken. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Night terrors, guilt, flashbacks, the hallmarks of what we'd now call post-traumatic stress, wrapped up in the trappings of medieval faith. Another case comes from Ralph of Caen, a chronicler and participant in the First Crusade. He tells of a Frankish knight who, in the heat of battle, seemed to lose himself completely, slaughtering enemy after enemy, past any reasonable cause, consumed by a wild fury. Ralph cloaks it in the language of religious zeal, saying the man was drunk with God's vengeance, but to a sympathetic ear it sounds very much like someone who snapped under pressure. Afterward, Ralph notes, the knight was never quite the same. A shadow lingered over him, as if some part of his mind had been left behind on the battlefield. But you know, it wasn't just the Crusaders who left these traces of trauma in the record. If you turn eastward, to the pens of Muslim chroniclers, you hear very different voices, ones tinged with wit, sorrow, and a surprising sense of kinship in suffering. Usama ibn Munkideh, a Syrian nobleman, warrior, and poet, gives us a rare first-person window into the experience of the other side. His memoir, The Book of Contemplation, is full of sharp observations and dry humor. Usama never dwells at length on his own fears. He was far too dignified for that, but he peppers his stories with little glimpses into the hidden toll of war. One of his most memorable anecdotes is almost comical. Usama marvels at the peculiarities of the human heart. A man might stare down a rain of arrows without flinching, yet leap onto a table in terror at a snake slithering through his tent. He's pointing out, with a twinkle in his eye, that the bravest of warriors can be undone by the smallest of threats. These odd, unpredictable triggers, what we might now call phobias or anxiety responses, coexist with battlefield valor, and Usama knew it. There's another moment where Usama confesses, not without embarrassment, that during periods of high tension, he sometimes felt the urge to strike first, simply out of fear that his companions might betray him. You can hear the echoes of what modern psychologists would label hypervigilance, a state where danger seems to lurk behind every smile. Now, who among us hasn't felt that prickle of suspicion after a season of stress? Usama's honesty, even in passing, is a powerful reminder that trauma is not bound by creed or banner. And the dangers weren't only in the thick of battle. Usama recounts a harrowing scene when a mob in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem turned on him, and he was only saved by the intervention of a Frankish friend. In the moment, he was sure he would die. Long after, he wrote of trembling whenever the memory returned. It wasn't a lifelong affliction, but it lingered. Even a seasoned fighter could be haunted by the ghosts of survival. Usama's stories often circle back to older warriors, men who, after years of fighting, became almost obsessively cautious. His own father, he tells us, would fortify their castle at the slightest rumor of attack. It's easy to picture this grizzled veteran barking orders to reinforce walls, peer anxiously into the night, unable to rest. Was this wisdom? Or was it the residue of too many battles? A kind of anxious overreaction that kept him up long after the threat had passed. But let's not forget the sheer physical hardship that weighed on these men and women. The Crusades weren't all shining steel and righteous hymns. They were long marches through burning deserts, days without food, nights racked with sickness. Modern research tells us that such physical stresses can make psychological trauma all the harder to bear. Fatigue, hunger, disease, they wear down the body and the mind alike. We have a vivid account from Ralph of Coggeshall, a knight who joined the Third Crusade at the end of the 12th century. After months of siege warfare in blistering heat, Ralph describes how many crusaders began to see visions of their distant homes, or became convinced that they were cursed. He attributes these strange sights and beliefs to the temptations of demons, or perhaps the sun's relentless glare. But if you read carefully, you can see the outlines of hallucinations and breakdowns, the mind buckling under relentless pressure. Some men simply deserted, slipping away into the wilderness rather than face another day of horror. It's an age-old form of avoidance, one that shows up in every generation of soldiers, from ancient Troy to modern Afghanistan. Now, before you despair for these battered souls, let me remind you, faith was their shield and their solace. It was the one tool they had, however blunt, to make sense of the chaos and bloodshed. Many crusaders clung to the belief that suffering in a holy cause had meaning. Every wound, every lost comrade, every hardship along the way was redeemed by the promise of heavenly reward. If a knight saw his friends fall, he could tell himself, "They are martyrs now, heroes in the eyes of God." If he found himself haunted by the memory of a brutal act, he could frame it as righteous, part of a divine plan. Psychologists today would call this cognitive reframing, finding a narrative that transforms pain into something bearable. Contemporary chronicles are full of scenes where, amid the carnage, crusaders sang psalms and hymns, their voices rising above the moans of the dying. Their faith acted as a kind of psychological armor, blunting the worst of the wounds. But, as you might expect, that armor was not unbreakable. When the tide of war turned, when battles were lost, when innocent blood was spilled, or when the righteous cause seemed to falter, the same faith could become a millstone. The Second Crusade ended in disaster, and many returning knights were engulfed by shame and confusion. Had God turned his face away? Had they sinned and been punished? The chronicler Odo of Doyi tells of crusaders lapsing into sorrow and self-reproach, convinced they were being chastised for their failures. It all sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? The survivor's guilt, the sense of unworthiness, the dark suspicion that perhaps one is being punished for some hidden flaw. In the medieval world, this took the form of spiritual anguish, a sense that one's suffering was deserved, or that the soul was tainted by sin. A knight might think, If I were truly good, I would not be tormented by these memories. The language is different, but the pain is the same. For a truly haunting example, let me tell you about Margaret of Beverley. She wasn't a knight, but an Englishwoman caught in the siege of Jerusalem when Saladin's armies retook the city in 1187. Imagine her, huddled in the rubble, the air thick with smoke, the city walls trembling with every assault. She survived, escaped, and eventually became a nun. But the war followed her into the cloister. Her brother wrote that Margaret would wake the other nuns at night with her cries, reliving the horror of the siege. She startled at loud noises, flinched at sudden shadows, classic symptoms we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Some pitied her. Others found it unseemly for a nun to behave so. There was a sense, in some quarters, that trauma was only for soldiers, or that civilians, especially women, should simply bear up under adversity. It's a reminder that medieval society, for all its piety, could be unsympathetic to suffering that didn't fit its expectations. The bad madness of non-combatants was ridiculed or dismissed as weakness, a kind of energy gone to waste, instead of heroic endurance. By the 13th century, the Crusades had become not just a movement, but an institution. Military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, took the raw material of battle-hardened men and tried to mold them into something more durable. They lived under strict rules, daily prayer, silence at meals, confession, a communal way of life that was meant to keep their spirits as disciplined as their sword arms. The Templars, for instance, required their brothers to confess their sins regularly, to pray together, to eat in silence, and to support each other as a true fraternity. It's tempting to see this as an early form of group therapy, isn't it? Within these stone walls, men who had seen too much, done too much, could unburden themselves, at least a little. There are records of Templar chaplains noting that some brothers were troubled in spirit after battle, and prescribing penitential psalms and special prayers for their healing. In a way, these orders acted as a medieval peer support network, a brotherhood where the burdens of war could be shared, if not always lightened. Of course, such strict discipline could also backfire. Some Templars became so ascetic, so severe, that it's hard not to wonder if spiritual numbness had set in, a sort of emotional armor that eventually became the only thing they could feel. So, if you step back and look at the era of the Crusades, the pattern is clear. Medieval soldiers and those swept up by war did suffer psychological wounds. They just had a different vocabulary for it, a language of spirits, sin, and faith. Their resilience was real, but it wasn't invincible. When the cracks showed, the answers they were offered were spiritual ones: penance, prayer, ritual, confession, all aimed at healing the invisible wounds of the soul. We can see this most clearly in the writings of theologians like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas tackled the question of just war and the perils it brought to the soul. He warned that, even in a righteous cause, a soldier could be corrupted if he fought with cruelty or hatred. War, he argued, had the power to stain the soul, so much so that returning warriors needed repentance and purification before they could rejoin the ordinary life of the faithful. The Eastern Church, too, recognized this need for spiritual healing. Centuries before the Crusades, Saint Basil of Caesarea, whose words became doctrine in the Orthodox world, recommended that any soldier who killed in war, even lawfully, abstain from Holy Communion for 3 years, not as a punishment, but as a period of healing, a time to cleanse the soul's hands before returning to the altar. In the Byzantine era, this rule was sometimes enforced, a quiet acknowledgement that killing, even in defense of the faith, left a mark that only time and prayer could erase. Think of these practices as ancient analogues to counseling or decompression. Instead of sending a knight straight back to everyday life, the Church imposed fasting, prayer, and a period of reflection, creating, in their own way, a structure for processing trauma. It may seem harsh to us, but perhaps it gave these soldiers a way to find meaning amid the chaos, a ritual for stitching up the wounds that couldn't be seen. So as we read between the lines of these chronicles and letters, as we listen for the voices that tremble beneath the surface, we find, again and again, that the scars of war were not just wounds of the flesh. They were wounds of the mind, the spirit, and the conscience. And medieval society, for all its differences, wrestled with these wounds in ways that are at once alien and strangely familiar. Now, as the last embers settle in our hearth, let's turn our gaze westward and forward in time. The Crusades were only the beginning. Well, as we enter the late Middle Ages, the 14th, 15th centuries, warfare in Europe changed in scale and nature, and with it, the ways that trauma was recognized and sometimes ignored would change too. Let's see how the next chapter unfolds. Let's settle in by the fire once again and journey into the heart of the late Middle Ages, those stormy centuries when the very nature of war in Europe shifted beneath the boots of its warriors. If you've ever wondered what it truly meant to fight, survive, and carry on in the 14th and 15th centuries, well, you're about to find out. This era was anything but peaceful. The 100 Years' War dragged on between England and France from 1337 to 1453. An entire era defined by siege, skirmish, famine, and fear. The Ottoman tide threatened what remained of Byzantium. Meanwhile, bands of mercenaries, sometimes called free companies, roamed the countryside between campaigns, pillaging villages, burning crops, and leaving terror in their wake. Now, what's especially fascinating about this period is that as the dust settled after each clash of arms, we finally begin to hear the voices of the warriors themselves. Personal letters, chronicles, and even stage plays started to capture something we rarely see in earlier sources: the raw, interior struggles of those who bore sword and shield. And, as you might expect, the psychological scars of war stood out in sharp relief. Let me introduce you to a knight who left behind perhaps the most striking testimony of this hidden battle, Geoffroy de Charnay. This knight, who met his end at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, was no mere brute. He was a thinker, a chronicler, and in many ways a man haunted by the realities of war. In his writings he describes how even the most secure fortifications, the sturdiest walls and the safest castles, couldn't keep out the terror that crept into a warrior's mind after the fighting. Imagine it, a knight finally at rest, but suddenly seized by invisible terrors, his heart pounding in the quiet darkness, wrestling not with a flesh and blood foe, but with the phantoms of dread and memory. Charney describes how, in these moments, it could feel as if all of nature itself had turned against him. Trees looming, the wind howling, shadows flickering with menace. It's a profound sense of alienation, a numbness, a sense that the world itself is no longer trustworthy. And, my friends, doesn't that sound familiar to what we now call the aftershocks of trauma? But here's where Charney's medieval worldview really comes through. He insists that true courage is found not just in defeating one's enemies on the field, but in conquering these inner demons. He frames these bouts of terror as trials sent directly by God, obstacles placed along the path to true honor. There can be no bravery without madness, he writes. Now, pause a moment. What a startling phrase, don't you think? The line between heroism and insanity is razor thin, he seems to say. A knight must flirt with a kind of controlled madness to be fearless in battle. It's almost reminiscent of the Viking berserkers who embraced a wild, frenzied state before charging into the fray. Yet, even Charney acknowledges that if that madness ever slips out of control, it can become a devastating illness, what we might now recognize as a kind of medieval PTSD. He tries to offer advice, suggesting that knights focus on fighting for a righteous cause to protect themselves from lasting psychological harm. If a knight's conscience is clear, he argues, then the weight of violence might not crush his spirit. Of course, whichever side is right is up for debate. History is written by the victors, after all. But the idea stands, and, interestingly enough, modern studies echo this belief. Soldiers who feel morally justified in their actions are less likely to suffer from trauma's worst after effects. Medieval wisdom meeting modern science, right there by the fireside. Now, let's turn to another chronicler, Jean Froissart, whose vivid accounts of the 100 Years' War offer us a front-row seat to the battlefield's chaos and its aftermath. Froissart doesn't use the language of psychology, but he's keenly observant. He describes English archers who, after years of brutal conflict, would startle at the slightest sound, their nerves frayed, their sleep forever broken. Even in peaceful camps, they were jumpy, always half ready to reach for their bows at the faintest cry. Froissart also tells of mercenaries who, once peace was declared, simply couldn't adapt to civilian life, cast adrift without battle to give them purpose. Many turned to banditry, unable to settle into the daily rhythms of farming or trade. Yes, economics played a part. These men needed food and coin. But Froissart hints at something deeper. The violence had become a part of them, a restless energy that could not be tamed. It's not so different from the stories we hear today, is it? Modern veterans sometimes struggle to readjust, haunted by habits and memories forged in combat. But perhaps Froissart's most haunting anecdote comes after the traumatic Battle of Poitiers in 1356. He writes of a French knight found wandering the field, dazed and speechless, surrounded by the bodies of his friends and comrades. This man was alive, but so deeply shocked that he could neither speak nor react. Only after weeks of care at home did he slowly return to himself. Froissart's matter-of-fact tone suggests this wasn't uncommon. Battle shock, as we'd call it now, was recognized even then. In World War I, they called it shell shock. Here, in the 14th century, It's the same syndrome, the mind overwhelmed by unimaginable horror. Let's leap from the chronicler's pages to the world of the stage for a moment. Shakespeare, writing in the 1590s, crafted Henry IV, Part 1, which dramatizes the events of 1403. Now, you might say, wait, isn't Shakespeare a bit late for the Middle Ages? True enough, but he drew heavily on the stories and legends passed down from that era. And in his portrayal of Sir Henry Hotspur Percy, we get a literary snapshot that's almost diagnostic. Lady Percy, Hotspur's wife, speaks of her husband's sleepless nights, of his sudden cries in the dark, his restlessness, his emotional distance, and his inability to enjoy the comforts of home. She describes him hearing phantom trumpets, forever reliving the chaos of battle, even in peacetime. Shakespeare, with his keen eye for human frailty, paints Hotspur as a man tormented by his war experience, and his audience would have recognized these symptoms. They had lived through the Wars of the Roses themselves, and many had seen returning soldiers forever altered by what they'd witnessed. It's a classic case of art reflecting life. Shakespeare's Hotspur isn't just a character. He's a mirror for countless real knights who, centuries before, struggled privately with the same ghosts. And perhaps that's why the lines still ring so true today. Speaking of extraordinary figures, let's not forget Joan of Arc. She wasn't your typical medieval soldier, but she led armies in the 1420s with a mix of divine conviction and deep empathy. Chronicles describe Joan as a woman who, even after victory, would weep for the fallen, friends and enemies alike. After the siege of Orléans, for example, she comforted dying enemy soldiers, praying for their souls and shedding tears as she moved among them. Some scholars now interpret these actions as signs of acute emotional sensitivity. The violence of war clearly affected Joan deeply, despite her almost superhuman resilience in battle. She was known to be overwhelmed by the suffering she saw, yet her faith allowed her to channel that pain into compassion and resolve. During her later trial, she spoke frankly about how the noise and chaos of battle tested her, and how she relied on her visions and her sense of higher purpose to keep going. Joan's story is unique, anchored as it is by an intense spiritual conviction. But it's also a testament to how the era's understanding of piety and meaning could serve as a bulwark against the worst ravages of trauma. For Joan, faith became a shield for her mind, just as armor protected her body. Without it, one wonders if the weight of the violence would have crushed her entirely. Now, as the Middle Ages drew to a close, the horrors of war didn't just fade away. They left their mark on the collective memory. Take the Battle of Towton in 1461, fought during England's Wars of the Roses. This single, brutal encounter claimed perhaps 28,000 lives in a single day, a staggering toll, and, for those who enjoy a bit of trivia, still the largest one-day death count on English soil. We don't have a diary from a Towton survivor, but later chroniclers talk about how the memory of the battle hung over the landscape like a shadow. Locals claim to see ghosts on the field every year on the anniversary, as if the trauma itself had seeped into the very earth. It's a striking example of how trauma becomes folklore. Whether those ghosts were real or just projections of a haunted memory, the point stands. The psychological wounds of mass slaughter ripple outward shaping the stories people tell for generations. In a way, these tales of restless spirits were an attempt by communities to come to terms with loss and horror, too vast to put into everyday words. And what about the fall of Constantinople in 1453? In the Byzantine East, the trauma was just as deep. Niccolò Barbaro, a Venetian chronicler who survived the siege, wrote about the despair that gripped the defenders in those final days. He describes men who, after weeks without sleep, broke down in tears as Ottoman cannons shattered the city walls. Some fell into a numb silence, unable to process the scale of the disaster, while others erupted in a frenzy of desperate courage. After the city finally fell, survivors spoke of nightmares, visions of collapsing walls, and swarming enemies haunting their sleep for years to come. Greek refugees, scattered across the Mediterranean, carried these stories with them, turning personal trauma into a kind of cultural memory. This pattern wasn't limited to a handful of tragic tales. Across late medieval Europe, a curious phenomenon emerged with each hard-won peace. Bands of veterans who simply couldn't return to ordinary life. After the 100 Years' War ended in 1453, England found itself teeming with unemployed archers and men-at-arms. Many of these men had known nothing but war since their youth. King Henry VI tried to coax them back to farming, offering money and land. But, as you might guess, the transition rarely took. Some drifted into outlaw bands, unable or unwilling to rejoin a world that no longer made sense to them. Sure, the need for food and income drove some of these choices, but chroniclers often described these ex-soldiers as ruffians or lost souls, hinting at something more than just poverty. It's as if the experience of war had permanently altered their spirits, making it all but impossible to settle back into the rhythms of normal life. The aggression, the restlessness, the sense of being forever on the outside, they all echo the symptoms of untreated trauma that we recognize in veterans today. And here, at the end of the Middle Ages, we see a society grappling, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with startling insight, with the reality that not all wounds are visible. The stories, the chronicles, the ghostly legends, they're all attempts to name and explain something that, in truth, still eludes us. How do you heal a mind battered by war? How do you welcome home someone who, in many ways, never truly left the battlefield? So, as our fire dies down and we prepare to journey onward in our story, let's carry these questions with us. The Middle Ages may be over, but the challenges of war's aftermath are far from gone. In our next chapter, we'll look even closer at the ways medieval soldiers coped, or didn't, with these hidden wounds, and how their struggles echo through to our own time. So, let's turn the page together and find out what the late Middle Ages truly left behind. As we sit here, the fire crackling and shadows flickering on these old stone walls, you might wonder, how do we truly sum up the experience of medieval soldiers and their struggles with trauma? Let me tell you. The late Middle Ages left us with more than just battered armor and faded banners. We actually have first-hand accounts. Men like Sir John de Joinville, Shahad ibn Fadlan, and a host of less famous fighters who describe, sometimes in hushed tones, the deep fear the restless nights, the emotional wounds that followed them long after the battlefield fell quiet. They don't always call it trauma, of course, but the signs are there, hiding between the lines of their stories. Now, you might think that a knight in shining armor was immune to such things. After all, chivalry demanded strength of body and mind. But here's the twist. The entire system of chivalry was built around the idea that suffering, the kind that gnaws at your spirit, was a mark of honor. Knights weren't just expected to swing their swords bravely. They were told to swallow their fears, to keep their composure even as their minds reeled from what they had seen. But why do you think the chroniclers spent so much ink urging knights to be stoic? Maybe, just maybe, it's because so many struggled to live up to that impossible ideal. Religion, too, held sway over how trauma was understood. Faith was a constant companion, sometimes a comfort, sometimes a burden. The church offered its own remedies: prayer, confession, acts of charity. Take the advice from Christine de Pizan's Book of Deeds and Arms of Chivalry, written around 1410. She blends ancient military wisdom with the spiritual lessons of her time, urging knights to confess their sins and seek divine grace before setting foot on the battlefield, and again upon returning. Why? Because war, she hints, doesn't just threaten your body. It threatens your very soul and sanity. She goes on to recommend that returning warriors should give alms and set out on pilgrimages, not only to thank God for their survival, but to wash away the stains that war leaves behind. Imagine that, a knight, battered and weary, setting off down winding roads to distant shrines, hoping the journey might heal what the battle had broken. In many ways, this was their version of a decompression period, like the ones modern armies use to help soldiers adjust to life after combat. Of course, in the Middle Ages, your therapeutic journey might be interrupted by a bandit or two if you weren't careful. Medieval self-care with an extra dash of danger. So, let's circle back to the big question that started our tale. Did medieval soldiers actually suffer from what we'd now call PTSD? I'd wager the answer is a resounding yes. They absolutely did, even if the label hadn't been invented yet. When you look at the evidence, stories from across centuries and cultures, from Europe to the Near East, you find a consistent pattern of men haunted by memories, gripped by dread, and changed by what they'd endured. It's hard to read these accounts and not see echoes of what we recognize today as post-traumatic stress. But before we start handing out diagnostic manuals to the ghosts of the past, let's remember that medieval society saw trauma through a very different lens. Today, we talk about PTSD as a medical condition, something to be treated with therapy or medication. But in those days, people understood suffering as a matter of morality, the soul, and the community. A knight's nightmares might be interpreted as a guilty conscience wrestling with sins committed in battle. Those sudden flashbacks? Perhaps they were seen as the literal phantoms of the fallen, come to trouble his sleep. And when a soldier withdrew from the world, grew silent or sullen, maybe people chalked it up to spiritual exhaustion, a world weariness that couldn't be eased by mere rest. Of course, not every soldier was shattered by their experiences. Just as today, resilience varied wildly. Some knights seemed to thrive on war, boasting in their memoirs about their exploits with barely a hint of regret. Maybe they truly didn't feel the weight of what they'd done. Or maybe, just maybe, they kept their darkest nights to themselves, letting their bravado shield them from judgment, both from others and from themselves. It's a mystery that even the cleverest chronicler, or a humble scribe like myself, can't fully unravel. But let's not forget the majority. The men who didn't wear shining armor or ride into battle at the head of a charge. Most medieval combatants were ordinary folks, men at arms, conscripted peasants, archers plucked from muddy fields and pressed into service. Their stories are rarely written down, but every now and then we catch a glimpse. A village chronicle might mention how local men returned from campaign changed, some meek as lambs, others quick to anger and ready to quarrel over the smallest slight. It stands to reason, doesn't it, that the trauma of war spared no one, high-born or humble. Picture the poor archer from Agincourt, mourning friends lost in the mud, his nightmares just as real as any noble's, though his only comfort might be a tankard of ale and a quiet conversation with his wife by the hearth. And speaking of families, have you ever thought about the ones waiting at home? Wives, mothers, children, they bore their own burdens when soldiers returned. Shakespeare's Lady Percy, for instance, noticed the deep changes in her husband after battle, her words capturing the confusion and grief that families have always felt. Medieval literature is full of such stories. The veteran who comes home, changed, sometimes kinder, more often harsher, and closed off. Even in ancient tales like Odysseus slaying the suitors, you see that old motif of the battle-scarred man who struggles to fit back into the world he left behind. These stories get retold in every age, each time with a new twist, but always echoing that same universal ache. Well, friends, that's my tale for tonight. I thank you for sitting with me by the fire, for lending your ears and your hearts to these stories of long-ago battles and the quiet struggles that followed. My deepest thanks go out to those who support these chronicles: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, the Gitmas, Gary, Charlene, Linteris, Katiana, Nicholas, Eulad, Nia, Charles, Christine, again, yes, you're hearing your name twice because your double generosity deserves double mention. Dr. Neuron Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Malene, Melissa, Ordox, Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HM. If I've mispronounced a name, blame my old scribe's eyes and the dim candlelight. Thank you, truly, for sharing in this exploration. And to anyone listening who knows firsthand the weight of trauma, whether from war or any other ordeal, you have my deepest sympathy and respect. I hope for each of us that we find some measure of peace and that we build little corners of paradise for ourselves, even if it takes a lifetime of searching. That, perhaps, is the greatest quest of all. I won't lecture you further, but I will wish you a good night and send all my warmth your way. Farewell, friends, until we meet again by the fire.